Everyone, welcome. We are going to talk a little bit about writing to avoid products liability litigation, which is super exciting, right? Glad to be doing that early this morning. By way of background, I'm an FDA regulatory attorney, but I've been with MedMark in-house for the last 6 years or so. Before that, I was in private practice with a couple of large firms, and then before that, my first legal job was with FDA. But I've really been around the industry for my entire life. My family does pharmaceutical manufacturing, so I've worked in any number of jobs there over the years. I worked on packaging lines and doing inventory audits and answering phones, really whatever needed to be done whenever I was on a school break. So I've always been able to look back on that experience. It was helpful to have in my head a picture of what a plant should look like. As I progressed and learned about FDA regulations, I realized that there were reasons they did things the way they did, why the plant looked the way it did. It was because they had to comply with all of these FDA regulations. And I understood the burden on companies that had important business goals that were really hemmed in by some of these regulations. So I've always approached my role in the process is understanding the regulations well enough to be able to play with them and to listen to my clients, understand their business goals, and help them find the best, most compliant way to achieve their goals. Quick disclaimer, educational purposes, not legal advice. What we're going to do today is talk a bit about what products liability is, where it comes from, what it means. And then we'll see where documents fit into that overall picture. We'll talk a bit about how plaintiffs actually get a hold of your documents, and most importantly, we'll cover your role in the process. When you are doing your day-to-day work, what kind of impact do you have on later potential litigation for your company? So to start, what is products liability? It is a very old legal theory. It predates the United States. It came from England. And it's the original consumer protection law. It recognizes that the manufacturer, the seller of a product, is better suited to bear the burden of any injuries that are caused by the product. Some pretty famous products liability cases in the past that I'm sure most of you have heard of, the McDonald's hot coffee case. At the time, it was kind of presented as a punchline. How stupid is this person? They didn't know their coffee was going to be hot. And it was also held up as an example of why we needed tort reform in the United States. But really, this woman had a valid products liability claim against McDonald's. In that case, the plaintiff was an elderly woman. She was driving with her grandson, and they stopped at McDonald's, went through the drive-thru, she got some coffee, and they pulled off to the side so she could add cream to the coffee. She took off the lid of the cup, and as she did so, it kind of jostled a little bit and spilled her lap. And in the few seconds it took her to react and to pull the hot clothing away from herself, she suffered third-degree burns. She required skin grafts, and she had permanent scarring and pain because of the injury. And as she dug more into the background, she learned that McDonald's company policy required their franchisees to hold coffee at 180 degrees. And most other restaurants in the area held their coffee at 140 degrees. So she argued that it was unreasonable for her to expect the coffee to be that hot, dangerously hot. And McDonald's should have warned her that their product was different than the average product on the market. And she won her case. The jury awarded her enormous damages, which were reduced by the court. She ended up settling with McDonald's for about $500,000. But it was a valid claim. It wasn't the joke that it was presented to be in the news. Another classic example is the Ford Pinto. This was Ford's response to the influx of European subcompact cars in the late 60s and early 70s. So what Ford wanted to do was design a car that was going to be under $2,000, under 2,000 pounds. It was a very strict guideline for them. And as a result, part of the design, the gas tank ended up in a pretty vulnerable position. And one of the engineers discovered a way to mitigate the risk. It was a $2 part they would have had to add. And the management at Ford denied that amendment to the design. They said it would have put it over budget, overweight, and so they went without it. And as a result, people driving the Pinto in relatively minor accidents, some were killed due to cars exploding because the fuel tanks ruptured. It ended up costing Ford millions of dollars, both in recalls and litigation, as well as the hit that it took to their reputation, because they were on record as putting their company finances ahead of their customers' safety. And finally, the tobacco litigation. There were documents discovered that demonstrated the tobacco companies knew well before it was ever known to users of the product that smoking caused cancer, it caused heart disease. There were any number of conditions that were made worse by smoking, and that nicotine was addictive. And the cigarette companies continued to use nicotine to keep their steady market of customers coming back for more cigarettes who were injured by the use of the product. Once that was discovered, it really turned the tide in the litigation. And they also suffered, or they also were awarded enormous sums of money as settlements after that litigation. What do we mean when we talk about a defective product? A product is defective if it meets 3 prongs. It has to be unreasonably dangerous. The defect has to be present at the time the product leaves the manufacturer's control. And the defect has to cause the injury. So we can illustrate this a bit with an example. Think of a bicycle. A manufacturer makes a bike. They want it to be really lightweight. And so the material they use to create the frame is maybe not as strong as it needs to be for whatever they're selling the bike to do, whether it's a mountain bike or whatever. And someone riding the bike is injured because part of the frame collapses and can't support them. In that situation, you would have an unreasonably dangerous design of the bike. It existed when it left the manufacturer's control, and the defect caused the injury. If you had the same person riding the same exact bike with the same exact construction that was really insufficient, but maybe they were just street riding, it wasn't a big deal, they weren't really pressing the limits of what the bike could do, and the bike held up, but they were hit by a car as they were riding the bike. In that case, you might have that same exact product defect, but because it didn't actually cause the injury, you don't have a products liability claim. What do we mean by unreasonably dangerous? The standard that we're using is the reasonable consumer and the reasonable seller. What does a consumer expect to purchase when they're buying a product? And what is someone who is selling that type of product, what would they be willing to put on the market? And what do we mean by a product? Is it the package you take off a shelf at the store? Is it just the material that's inside that package when you get it home? It is that, and it is much more. It is all of the packaging, the labeling, the warnings, the instructions, the owner's manual, installation instructions, assembly instructions, sales brochures, the words that your sales reps might say to someone who is going to be buying or prescribing the product. It's all of these things together, and the defect can appear in any of these areas. There are also tremendous costs due to something going wrong with your product. In tort litigation and products liability makes up a large percentage of tort litigation. It costs the United States economy $429 billion in 2016. And that was actually an improvement. It's been about double that previously. By contrast, this is more than the entire budgets of Homeland Security, NIH, and the Department of Education combined. And if you notice here in this chart, about 1/3 of all of that money is going to legal fees. There are also huge business costs. For every dollar that companies are putting into litigation, it's money they're not spending on R&D. They're not putting new products out there and selling those products. So there are lost profits. And this puts us at a substantial detriment compared to global competitors as well. The United States is spending 2.3% of its GDP on litigation, but it's 0.7% in the UK, 0.8% in Japan, and 1.1% in Germany. Why is that? What makes us different than our global competitors? It's really that we have a very well-organized plaintiffs' bar. They are constantly trolling for new plaintiffs, new customers. They're doing it on television. I'm sure if any of you are watching TV late at night, you're used to seeing ads like these. They are on the internet. All you have to do is plug in a couple of keywords and you have thousands of results in seconds. And there's also a treasure trove of information in the public domain, mostly on FDA's website. All of the adverse event reports that companies are required to file with FDA are publicly available. Recalls have to be made public so that people can return products if there's an issue with them. And warning letters are on FDA's website as well. These detail exactly which deficiencies FDA has found when they've gone into companies and investigated their facilities or looked at their sales practices if they're selling unapproved products. All of that is spelled out in the warning letters, which are also publicly available on FDA's website. Medmark conducts a survey of our defense panel every couple of years. And this is a very broad group of attorneys who do this type of litigation on a regular basis. They work in large and small cities, large and small firms, and 65% of them stated that in some or most of their cases, the plaintiff became aware of a potential cause of action because of an FDA enforcement action. So they're watching, and their attorneys are watching. So if companies are having significant adverse events and the trend is not being addressed, or if they have to recall products, or if they're having bad inspections where FDA is citing numerous observations to the point that they're getting warning letters, they are putting themselves at greater risk of a products liability action.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So, it's not like that in the rest of the world? There's no reporting body that basically tells consumers
there are FDA corollaries in the rest of the world, but the litigious nature of the society is drastically different in the United States than elsewhere. Medmark writes policies all over the world. We have worldwide coverage, but we are thrilled when they come. Like, foreign clinical trials are fantastic because the likelihood of someone ever suing is incredibly low. In the United States, there's always a risk. Okay. This is also a really difficult environment for the life sciences industry. There has been a lot of focus on companies putting the dollar, the profit, ahead of the consumer safety. There have been documentaries like The Leading Edge on Netflix. I don't know if any of you have seen this. It's relatively new. And it talks about medical devices that were approved and implanted into patients and later caused health issues. Things like the eShore birth control device and metal-on-metal hips. And it talks about the way that FDA allows devices to enter the marketplace. And it really argues that the FDA oversight of devices is insufficient to maintain safety for patients. So there are two ways that FDA allows devices onto the market with some sort of pre-market review. First, there's the approval process, the pre-market approval. And that is much more like the drug process, where the company has a new or very risky device, and they get a lot of clinical data to support their application to FDA. And FDA makes a decision about whether the company has been able to demonstrate that the product is safe and effective. The other option is to file a 510K for perhaps lower risk devices. And in that case, what you're saying is that the device is substantially equivalent to something that's already on the market. And FDA says, yes, sure, your product is enough like this other product, go ahead and sell it. And what this type of documentary was doing was arguing that that 510K process was allowing unsafe products onto the market, that FDA wasn't doing their oversight job. We also have examples like the Theranos scandal, where this woman created a company, claimed that she could diagnose basically any disease from a single drop of blood, spent 10 years gathering money in Silicon Valley and promoting her company, and the entire thing was a fraud. And patients are not willing to stand back and watch at this point. This is actually a still from The Bleeding Edge. It's patients at a medical conference, a group of gynecologists, and they're outside protesting, claiming that these doctors should not be prescribing the eSure device. And things like this tend to make the local news too. And once that happens, it really becomes part of the public consciousness, and as a result, soon after, the plaintiff's attorneys follow. These are actual law firm ads using The Bleeding Edge to try to recruit new plaintiffs. And once a suit is filed, who is the jury pool? Who is going to make the decision about whether your product injured someone? It is a group of people who are very wary of corporations and have a pretty poor perception of the life sciences industry in particular. And who can really blame them when this guy is the face of that industry? So bearing all of this in mind, why is it that documents are such a focus of concern for us? And it is because plaintiffs frequently rely on documents to prove their case. They can be foundational for plaintiffs who are trying to prove that their product had a defect and that the manufacturer is obligated to compensate them. Does everyone remember Erin Brockovich? She found precisely one of these documents where a utility company, not on everybody's list of their favorite corporations, it declared in this document they knew they were poisoning the community and they did nothing about it. So why are documents so important in products liability? Let's take a step back first and talk about how we get to a products liability claim. When we're talking about products liability, it is a strict liability tort. That means that if a product, or if a plaintiff can demonstrate that the defect was present, then they don't have to prove that the manufacturer intended to cause harm or was negligent in some fashion. It makes it much easier for them to establish that they have a case, because the intent can be very difficult to prove. There are three types of product defects. There are manufacturing, design, and warning defects. So in a manufacturing defect, the plaintiff has to prove that the product left the manufacturer's control with the defect already existing. Some examples might be for damage. If you have a vial of medication and it leaves the manufacturer's facility with the seal punctured, maybe it's supposed to be a sterile injectable and it's no longer sterile. For assembly, perhaps you have a bariatric shower chair and the welding was insufficient so that when the patient goes to use it, it collapses under them. Or if it's failing to meet its specifications, maybe you have that same bariatric shower chair, but the wrong type of steel was used and it wasn't strong enough to hold the weight that it claimed it could. This is an example of how a document might contribute to a manufacturing defect. So this is an excerpt from a negotiation between a manufacturer and one of their component suppliers. And it says, with reference to your conversations with Medco and myself, this will confirm that under the circumstances of your purchase agreement with Medco, it is our recommendation that Medco be made responsible for all of their liability associated with the inferior products they're machining and supplying for us. So the underlying argument they're making here is that they want their component supplier to take responsibility for any injuries that stem from the components. That is absolutely normal. We advise our clients to do that all the time. They should always do that. But the manner in which they're doing it creates enormous vulnerability for products liability, because they are saying right here that they know they're purchasing an inferior component. They're putting that inferior component into their product, even though they know the quality isn't right. Even if this is not true and it's a fine component to use, this statement gives ammunition to a plaintiff's attorney who would later find this document. For a design defect, the plaintiff has to prove that there was an alternative design that would have made the product safer, and it was reasonable and feasible, and the manufacturer failed to use it. So if the product does not conform to state-of-the-art standards, and we talked about this yesterday, I don't mean state-of-the-art by being the most cutting-edge technology out there. The legal term state-of-the-art means really the baseline for the industry. What is expected across the industry? What are all of your competitors doing? If it's normal to include an alarm system on a ventilator or an automatic shutoff on a heating pad, if your product doesn't contain those things, you will be judged against what the rest of the industry is doing.
So when it says reasonable,
Yep.
is cost a reasonable alternative?
It depends. It has to be, if you're just looking at cost and you're saying, we could do this, it's going to make it safer, but it's going to cut our profit by a little bit, that would probably not be a reasonable decision, if it is a serious risk. If, maybe it's going to improve the safety, and we'll talk about this in a second. Maybe it'll improve the safety a little bit, but it's going to add significant cost and make it wouldn't make much sense for us to sell this product at that price. Then in that case, that's a reasonable assessment. So a document example relating to a design defect. A mid-level engineer writes a memo to his supervisor to recommend a small design change to the product. The memo suggests that the manufacturer could dramatically improve the safety of the product by incorporating a 30-cent per unit design modification. The manufacturer opted to disregard the modification on a cost-benefit analysis. Now this kind of sounds like the Ford Pinto example, right? And maybe a decade later, a plaintiff's attorney finds this document and uses it to support their burn case. But what if the safety feature was not going to prevent something like catastrophic burns? What if we're talking about a syringe and you're using it to administer medicine at home? It's someone who needs insulin or something like that. It's not going to be used in a clinical or provider setting, so it's just one person using the syringe. And what the engineer is suggesting is the type of safety cap that's used in hospitals and doctors' offices to protect the provider from a needle stick. Needle stick isn't really a concern when you're administering medication to yourself. So if you're adding a 30-cent part to a piece that sells for $1, it becomes a cost-prohibitive measure because it's not something that really needs to be enhanced. The important thing to think about is when you're doing this, maybe you make that decision not to use the enhancement, but what you need to do is give the complete context and include the rationale for why that enhancement was not included. And with a warning defect, the plaintiff needs to prove that there was a foreseeable risk, and that risk could have been reduced if the manufacturer had provided the appropriate warnings and instructions. And because they did not do that, it made the product unsafe, and that's why the plaintiff was injured. So here, a lack of appropriate warning symbols. If you're putting all of your warnings and instructions into your user's manual, and people rarely read the entire user manual, if it's possible to maybe put a sticker on the product itself where the user will see it, that is something that you should be doing in addition to your complete listing in the manual. Make it user-friendly. Look at the way they're going to use the product and address it in that way. On the pharma side, it might be not including all of the side effects that a drug might have. That's why you have that laundry list of horrible things in every TV commercial for a drug. So an example document here. In a routine reliability test, the units were subjected to temperatures above 125 degrees, and we found that the internal power coil not only overheats, but during the process, it begins to short out and eventually has the potential of starting the unit on fire. We have over 7,000 of these units out in the field, and a large number of them are in the Southwest, where there's a real possibility of experiencing these temperatures. Exclamation point. I hope we don't hear about any fires in the field, or this will become a major problem. Does this look familiar to anybody? So there are a few things here. First, we're talking about a routine reliability test. So this indicates that it should be conducted prior to the release of every production run. They are testing at temperatures above 125 degrees. How many environments that people are typically in using medical devices are at or above 125 degrees? I would venture none. And they found that the power coil overheats and begins to short out. Then they speculate that it has the potential to start the unit on fire. They haven't actually tested it and gotten that result. It just has the potential. It's not factual. They talk about all of the units they have in the field, most of which are not ever going to reach temperatures of 125 degrees. And they talk about a real possibility of this situation happening and a fire occurring. The statement at the end, I hope we don't hear about any fires or this will become a major problem. This becomes ammunition for a plaintiff's attorney, even if the fire that the device eventually causes has nothing to do with it being overheated, nothing to do with it being used in this type of environment. And one simple thing that the company could have done in this situation was to, if they know that above 125 degrees, it's going to have certain issues. It might overheat, it might short out. It would be very easy to put an instruction in the user manual or a sticker on the device itself. It says not to be used at ambient temperatures above whatever number they deem safe. Easily fixed by a warning defect because it's a scenario that's probably pretty rare. So how do plaintiffs get their hands on your documents? Discovery is the first phase of products liability litigation. And what happens after the plaintiff files their complaint, the defendant files their response, the next step is that both sides ask each other for whatever it is they want to know. The defendant's probably going to ask for all the medical records and any information about the device itself, the device if they have it, so it can be inspected, anything to support the scenario that the plaintiff is describing. And the plaintiff is going to ask for absolutely everything ever written in the company about this particular product. Everything, related or not.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How would you find what was written about that product in particular? I mean, would that just be a search through email or?
So that's poor Helen's job.
Okay.
She gets the enormous list of asks and coordinates. Everyone has to hunt for the material. So under the federal rules of civil procedure, pretty much everything is discoverable. It can be in any medium. It can be documents, it can be drawings, graphs, anything in the design phase as you were developing this product, charts, trending information about problems. It can be recordings of customer service calls. Any of that information is discoverable. And life sciences companies, by the nature of their business, generate a lot of this information. You have everything that's available under Rule 34, plus you have all of the information that comprises your product itself. So the warnings, the advertising, sales rep information, all of this goes into the discoverable pot as well. Document management procedures can also create a problem. Life sciences companies tend to hold on to documents for a fairly long time, especially for companies that are making products with a long lifespan. It's a little easier on the drug side where things expire after a couple of years, but for durable medical equipment, you can have people using a device for 25 years. They probably shouldn't be, but they will. So the documents stick around for longer than might otherwise be necessary. This increases the amount of material that has to be turned over and the burden on companies when they have to respond to discovery requests. And the more information you turn over, the greater the likelihood that a problematic document will appear. The business surrounding discovery has changed to reflect the changes in the business world. Most of our documents now are created electronically. FDA even is requiring its documents to be provided electronically. Some things are never converted to paper. So e-discovery lets you sort through the documents that are requested electronically. It also allows you to incorporate emails and text messages, things that are never actually created on paper in the first place. And this represents a pretty stark change from the way litigation used to go. When I first started out, document review was done physically. You would have file boxes of materials that were sent to a particular storage space. The youngest attorneys with the cheapest billing rate would be sent to go dig through all of these boxes. They didn't necessarily understand the bigger picture of the case, but they were sent to dig through and find anything they possibly could. And it used to give a bit of an advantage to defendants who had more money to spend on lawyers to dig through all of these boxes and produce more of the documents, knowing that the plaintiff's firms were typically much smaller and didn't have the manpower to sort through and look for that needle in a haystack. So they sent them very large haystacks. But that has all changed. Now, instead of sending physical documents to one location, they create virtual data rooms. And the people who are involved in working on the case have access to the data room. They can review all of the documents at their desks. And they have software that can run keyword searches. They can search for exclamation points. They can search for handwritten notes. All of this takes it from searching for a needle in a haystack to basically Googling for the information you want. It is a much more expensive process because you're paying all of these intermediaries to gather and process and make available the data and handle all the security features. But it also levels the playing field. The plaintiff has a much easier time finding the material they want to support their case. So most importantly, what can you do? How does your daily work impact this whole process? The most critical thing that you can do is to think before you write. The tone and the content of your documents can take something that is potentially problematic and make it seem innocuous, and it can take completely innocuous documents and turn them into a problem. What do we mean by tone? Tone is really the way you're expressing yourself. It is the emotion that you're conveying in your writing. I'm sure every one of us at some point has received an email, maybe someone is trying to push their work off on you, or your supervisor wants you to do something that's really annoying and you don't really think it's your job, but you're gonna do it, you're annoyed, but your response to them is maybe a little bit snippy or more formal than your normal writing, and you're using that to convey that you're not thrilled about this, or you're a little annoyed with the request. That is tone. And it's very different to use it in that type of situation than it is in anything related to a product or a customer of the company. So think about how your tone is reflected when it's put in front of a jury. So does everybody remember the miracle weight loss drug of the 90s, Fen-Phen? So that company, or that product, was marketed by American Home Products. It was a part of Wyeth. And it took two drugs that were already on the market, neither of which on its own had any real impact on weight, but together it had a pretty significant impact on patients' ability to lose weight. However, what they didn't realize was that this drug combination caused serious lung damage and damage to valves in the heart as well. It caused a potentially fatal lung disease, pulmonary hypertension, and it damaged the aortic and mitral valves of the heart. So people who used Fen-Phen for any length of time and had this type of damage sued American Home Products. They ended up settling for $3.75 billion, which was put in a trust that is still paying out nearly 20 years later because people are still learning of damage that the product caused to them years ago. And this quote here was from an internal email within American Home Products. And it was someone who was just emailing her coworker, her friend. She was annoyed that all she was doing was writing checks for these people because of the settlement. And she said she didn't want to spend the rest of her career writing checks for fat people who are a little afraid of some silly lung problem. Some silly lung problem that was potentially fatal. And let's take a step back here. This woman was writing checks. She had a finance role. She wasn't involved in the product development. She wasn't involved in the warnings, the manufacturing, the design. She had no part in anything related to the injuries that these people faced. But because of this callous throwaway comment to a friend, this quote ended up in the Wall Street Journal and put the entire company in a negative light at a time when they were in a pretty bad spot anyway. So your tone is always there, whether it's intended or not. So the example we gave before about being annoyed at a coworker and being a little snippy in an email, does it matter? Maybe, maybe not. But in a scenario when you are taking a customer service call, you need to make sure that you're getting all of the information you need to allow the next person in the chain to do their job. And you're trying to gather this information from people who are probably pretty angry, emotional, frustrated. And it's a challenging thing to do. And the manner in which you record that information is critical because it is discoverable information. You don't want to be the Fen-Phen employee. You never want to appear to be joking or belittling of your customers in any way. But you also don't want to be an inadvertent advocate for them. You don't want to be recording their statements verbatim. It's difficult, but you have to listen and process what they're saying and try to pick out from the emotion any of the facts that might be present. So if they're saying, this chair is terrible, I've had a problem every single time they've touched it, I think it's defective, I need a new one, the footrest keeps falling off, that's the part you need to focus on because that is something that has happened to the chair. There's a problem with the footrest. So you want to take their commentary out of the picture and focus on what's factual. What is the situation they're experiencing right now? The same is true for people working in product development. You might not have a forward-facing or customer-facing role in the company, but you're still able to create documents that can cause issues. And think back to Ford Pinto. So you don't want to create a situation in which the company is appearing to care more about the cost than about patient safety. You know, if you're doing some sort of cost-benefit analysis, make sure it's the complete picture. We considered adding this $2 safety fix, but we determined that if we added this part, it would cause another part of the chair to malfunction. Therefore, we decided against it and instead reduced the risk by including this warning instead, so that people would know to use the product in a certain way. You're showing your work. You have acknowledged that there is an issue, you've addressed it in the best way that you can, and you've closed that loop. You have to remember that the documents you're writing here could eventually be seen by a much broader audience who don't know the backstory. So your content has to be thorough so that they can understand as well. And when we say content, what we mean is really the meat of what's in the document. It's what you're saying. So we have an example here. A sample of the units were subjected to a routine quality test. Results reveal that 22% of the units do not match the specs, meaning that 22% of the total number of units produced are probably defective. Since this problem has just been diagnosed, there's no way of knowing how many defective units have already been shipped. Any issues? I would think so. So first of all, we're talking about a routine quality test. That implies to me that it's conducted every time you make the product, right? Results reveal that 22% of the units do not match the specs. How often is there one spec for a product? Never. So which spec is it not meeting? Is it something about the structure that could cause a safety problem, or is it the paint not adhering to the frame? Meaning that 22% of the total number of units produced. Total number of units produced. But we just said it was a routine quality test. And if it's the first time it's being noticed, that implies that everything that has been produced previously up until this test point must have matched. It must have passed that test. So doesn't this give us a hard stop on when product with an issue could have been produced? And this 22%, they are probably defective. How do we know this? We don't even know what the spec is that it's not meeting. Since this problem has just been diagnosed, so if you think it exists in many previous production runs, you're just noticing it now, and it's being found through a routine quality test, that indicates that perhaps you haven't been conducting that test, and that is a serious negligence issue. No way of knowing how many defective units have already been shipped. This assumes that the products that are not meeting this specification are defective. And it's saying that there is no way of knowing how many of them are out there. But of course you should know how many are out there, because the only ones that didn't pass the test are still in your facility. They're undergoing a routine quality test. This is not a drug situation where you're doing stability testing after something's been on the market for a year. If you're doing a quality test on a medical device, that device is still with you. There shouldn't be any defective units out there. So even though this has far too little fact to be drawing any kind of conclusion about defective units being shipped, that kind of inflammatory language is still being used. And this will be found by a plaintiff's attorney who is doing a keyword search of documents that are in a virtual data room. They'll search for defect or defective, and this is what they will find, and they will use it to demonstrate that the manufacturer was putting 22% of its products, a fifth of its products, on the market with a known defect. So, what if the failed spec was the paint color, or the paint adhering to the frame, and it wasn't something that was a matter of critical safety for the user? In that case, because there was so little context provided, because so much content was missing, the document becomes overly inflammatory, even more so than just that language suggests. So imagine a situation in a courtroom where the person who wrote that document is called to testify about it. And there's no information there about what the spec was that wasn't being met. And the plaintiff's attorney is just hammering on them, trying to get them to admit that it was the frame strength or whatever it was that caused the plaintiff's injury. And the person is sitting on the stand and they're saying, it was the paint. The paint wasn't sticking right. It kept chipping off. I swear, that was what it was. The jury is really just going to have to take your word for it in that case. And when there is someone who's an employee of a medical device company on the stand, this is the face the jury sees. It's difficult to ask them to just take your word for it, which is why robust documentation is so important. If there is something really minimal wrong with the device, do you maybe want to just walk down the hall and have that discussion with someone? Do you have to put it in a memo or in an email when you could just have a phone call? If you're doing that, if you're talking through your problems, then you have the ability to figure out the fix without creating a document trail. And if you determine that a document, a memo, an email is needed, you can always go back and write one later once you've determined the path you're going to take. No one is saying that you shouldn't ever write things down. What we're doing is stepping back and thinking, is this the best approach before the facts have been processed? Can we take a moment to think about what we're going to say first? So think when you're writing about what is factual and what is conjecture. You don't want to speculate about what could potentially happen. You want to talk about what you know and what you think the next steps might be, who you need to talk to, what kind of investigation is needed. Stick to the facts and your process and leave the editorializing out. And you want to remember to keep your language business-like, professional. No one is suggesting you can't joke around with your coworkers because it's the only thing that makes life tolerable. We're here all the time, right? But keep it in person, keep it on the phone, keep it out of the documents. Where do we see the most issues in documentation? It's in internal memos, external communication, emails, quality system documents, and complaints, customer service issues. Never forget that every copy of an internal memo is discoverable. It is not just the copy that's memorialized in a file. It is every single copy that's out there. So it might be your practice when you receive that type of document to delete it or shred it, but if you send it to an entire department worth of people, any one of those copies could be discovered as well. I'm sure you all have people you know who document every single thing so that if something goes awry, they can shift the blame. But everyone has a responsibility to think about whether they should be creating a paper trail. Does it need to be done in this case? Is there information that might better be delivered in person or in a phone call? The example I had recently was with a customer. Something had come up that caused sort of a red flag for us about their business practices. So I went down to visit them and met with them and talked about their business structure and what they were doing. They were a distributor of devices. And I realized that we were right, that this was something that didn't fit within our coverage appetite, and we were going to have to ask them to find a new insurance carrier. But the problem in the situation was that they were located in a state where the insurance regulators require every loss control visit to be followed by a report on the visit within 2 weeks. So in order for me to keep working in that state, I had to write a report about my visit. But I also knew that I don't have a privileged relationship with this company. They're not my client, I'm not their attorney. So anything that I wrote in that report would be discoverable if they were ever sued, and in all likelihood, they will be sued someday. So what I did instead was I talked with our team at the office, and I wrote an analysis of how they draft their contracts, their contracting practices, and gave them some information there about how they can improve contracts in general. And then we had a conference call with the client and their insurance broker and our team, and we discussed how they weren't a right fit for our company and they were going to have to move their coverage at their next renewal. So that way, I kind of walked that fine line. I met the regulatory obligation, but I didn't put down information in writing that could prove to be problematic for this company later on. So, when in doubt, pick up the phone. Also important to remember is that everything on the paper is discoverable. It is not limited to the text of the document itself. So any doodles that are in the margins, anything you scribble in the margins. I know when I'm editing a document, I always have to do it by hand. I print it out and I sort of refute arguments in the margins. If I had those kind of documents that were involved in a case and had to turn them over, anything I had scribbled would also be discoverable information. Word choice is also critically important. Words carry different weight. So in this example, we have an outline is attached for an experimental design to provide minimally required information to support product development. This scheme is structured to include the shortest practical time course for completion and at as low a cost as possible. So minimally required information. Does this convey the intended message, or does it read like you're trying to get away with putting in minimal effort? You might really be aiming for efficiency, but this does not give the right impression. It could be exploited to imply that you're putting insufficient effort into protecting patient safety. The same thing with scheme. It has a really negative connotation. You could use construct or mechanism, and it would get the same point across, but in a more neutral way. Shortest practical time course for completion. Does this mean you rushed through the design process? Did you skip steps that might have improved safety? Did you not catch any design flaws before the product was going to production? And as low a cost as possible. We're back to Ford Pinto. But maybe this was a good goal to have. Maybe your charge here was to create something with very efficient processes and a low cost to consumers, so that someone who might otherwise not be able to afford the particular care could have access to the device. Don't cheapen your meaning by using words that are bringing the wrong feel to the document. Also remember that people don't know your internal shorthand. So you need to write for people who haven't been in the room the entire time. Think about strangers reading the document and how they will process what you're actually saying. Does not want to do that slide today. There we go. So this is a memo from a pharmaceutical company, and they were having an issue with particulate in a solution they were making, which is normal. Sometimes you'll have things crystallize, or a crystal will burn or something, and it'll look like there's a little flake of something in the liquid. But here they describe the particulate as mouse turd-looking particles. So just imagine what would happen with this in the hands of a plaintiff's attorney. Your drug was potentially contaminated with mouse feces, rodent feces. So don't let your joking inappropriately direct attention to documentation. So think about word choice here. These are all words that come up pretty often. But are they the right ones to use? Is there something that could be used instead that has a more neutral tone to it? Hopefully you can avoid words like catastrophic. But maybe post-mortem, talk about a debrief instead. Failure, is it a factual failure or are you speculating about failure? Try to step back and think about what the words are actually conveying. So we have a few examples of this. First, the analysis may indicate device failure. Or, the analysis may indicate that the device will require adjustment. Requiring adjustment is pretty normal for a lot of medical devices. They require servicing. The intent is to use them and repair them. It's not a single-use product. When you're talking about the analysis revealing device failure, this is entirely different than a product that is going to fail if it's not properly serviced. So say what you mean. Don't use the shorthand because it delivers a very different message. The memo misrepresented the test results. Or, the memo did not provide all of the relevant information about the test results. In the first one, it appears that the person lied, that you're accusing someone of lying about test results. In the second, you might be having a legitimate disagreement. One person thinks A and B are significant, the other person thinks C and D are significant, and they're making their argument here. Misrepresented is a very different message. Convey what you actually mean, not what the people who are in the room might understand. The thing that is really galling is that I feel like I have been beaten by my own cook bee instead of the competition. To put a questionable lot of product on the market is inexcusable. I don't know who is responsible for this decision, but it has to rank right up there with the Pinto gas tank. That's fine, right?
Yeah.
So, there is not a single piece of text in this excerpt. All of it is just venting an emotion, which is fine. Sometimes people need to vent, but if you really have to get this off your chest, pick up the phone, or better yet, talk to your spouse or your friend or your roommate. This is not something that should ever end up in a document. Here's another memo. Houston, we have a problem. So this could go one of two ways. Maybe you have a very serious problem. If you're joking in your memo line, then it makes you appear callous, like you're not understanding the importance of the problem you're about to address. If you don't actually have a problem and you're just using a funny subject, then you're drawing attention to a document that really isn't relevant. You're giving it more weight than it needs. So in this one, someone has been asked to look at raw material, conduct an analysis, and develop conclusions to submit. And in the conclusions, they are clearly not happy with this raw material. They say the raw material control is woefully unsatisfactory. It fails to meet FDA requirements. It compromises traceability requirements. And if I was the FDA, I would shut it down. So when someone is asked to conduct a raw material analysis, it's typically lab work, and you give lab conclusions. I don't think if I was the FDA, I would shut it down is a lab conclusion. Stick to the data, skip the editorializing. This is a quality hold notice. We're talking about sample units in the assembly process, and they were miswired. And then it states that the condition will probably lead to the unit shorting out and possibly catching on fire or becoming electrically live. How much of that is factual? Just the miswiring part. The rest of it is all speculation, and it's inflammatory, literally and figuratively. Then the field corrective action they choose to take, after speculating that it could catch fire or electrocute people, is a wait and see. There isn't much that we can do about these units. When we receive calls from customers about them, we will just have to arrange to have the defective ones returned and ship them a replacement. If you're talking about a device that you think is going to catch fire or electrocute people, you need to initiate a recall. You don't take a wait and see approach to that and say, well, I guess we'll just exchange it if they're unhappy. This is speculation that puts your company in a very bad position. If a plaintiff were to find this, it's sort of a slam dunk situation if their client were actually in a fire or electrocuted or something that is addressed here. So in short, if you do not, this is glitchy today. If you don't want to hear it read aloud in a courtroom for you to defend, do not put it in writing. Any questions? Yes.
I had one this morning, Zippy Village, and so he said, the sales agent said he was approved to go ahead and replace the whole unit. So he forwarded me the email, and there was a lot of other things in the email there, so I felt that I shouldn't tip it, so I only tipped the part where they put the approval of the replacement unit.
It's probably a right decision.
So I just kind of want to clarify, it's kind of similar to what the training was.
Could you send us that, could you send me that email? Do you have the email?
I did.
Yeah, would you send it to me, Roxanne Cromwell? Could you send it to me? We're looking for examples because, Kate's gonna do some training with the Salesforce, so to have some examples, we'll redact different things and just say.
Yeah, it was like conversations between product management and whatnot, and I'm like, I don't think it needs to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The two pillars you really want to keep in mind are truthful, factual, and neutral. If you don't know that something is fact yet, like dealer says the chair is defective, not a fact. It is not defective until the engineers look at it, examine it, and say, yeah, this actually is defective. Until that, it's just speculation. So that should never end up in something until it's demonstrated to be true. You can say instead the dealer asserts XYZ problem. If they're saying this happens all the time, it's happened for the last 5 customers I've serviced, dealer reports multiple incidences but does not have additional information or serial numbers. Now that type of thing. You're recording the facts, but you're keeping the emotion out of it. Yes?
This is kind of for both of us, and in our current complaint system, it asks specific questions on certain things, but when it asks to describe what happened, it's kind of like a blank canvas, and so it's left to the CSR and the person calling in to describe what happened. Would it not be better to have specific questions in that instead of asking for some sort of explanation, so you get more fact-based and not, you know, it's that game that you play when you're young, you know, somebody tells something here, and by the time it gets back here, it wasn't what was said. And so it's, you know, even though you're hearing it, you're having somebody translate it on the paper instead of a specific question like, right, you know, right where you're saying. Just, you know, so it keeps it fact-based, and it doesn't offer opinions or words that are descriptive or anything
I
like
think
that.
it's probably a tough balance because you don't want to limit the information you might get by just asking specific questions. But I think, and Sandy would probably know better, I think there's probably a lot of questions that you know to ask, right? To capture that information.
I'm sorry, I just
Well, no, I was saying, instead of having a blank canvas for the CSR to explain, shouldn't there be specific questions?
Yes,
So
like
you
a
don't.
template, like on the MDR when there's an urgency, like there's a template where it's like, exact height, weight,
Yes,
and
right.
exactly what happened. I'm actually working with Dale right now to do another template in that for product issues. So we're gonna create a template so it's more asking the questions, so you fill out those fields.
Right, so
I
it's
will
not
make
just,
sure
oh,
the
tell
fields.
me what happened, like in open story or something.
Yeah, exactly, so limit that a little bit, and then some of the fields will be mandatory to make sure that we do fill them in, so you can't accidentally miss a piece.
Sure, okay.
Anyone else?
So during product development, you have an iterations where things, you're testing, you're going through stuff, you're in production, or even pre-production, and there are failures that happen along the way.
Yep.
I mean, in emails, we email each other back and forth saying, we have a failure in this unit, because it's not the final unit that's going to be in production, there is those iterations, so obviously you can't mask the fact that,
And you shouldn't. You work in the real world. Part of making a product is it has to fail before you get to the
the
final
words like
design.
failure they have their place.
Yes.
When it's in development, testing.
The thing you have to keep in mind is that when you experience these failures, you're closing the loop. You're figuring out why it failed, and you're getting to the next step.
Yeah, but you're not gonna figure that out in one email.
Exactly.
Right, so
So
they
it's
take
perfectly
weeks and
fine.
months before
You just
do
have to
that.
make sure that everything is resolved.
Okay.
So it's a good practice to send a follow-up email once it's resolved, saying, we resolved these type of issues. Okay.
Yeah. Open matters are really the thing that's a problem. If something falls through the cracks, that's a liability issue. No one expects your first design to be the end design.
Yeah, we could do a better job of closing that loop at the end of every thing, because that will then, when the documents, those first level documents do hold weight, obviously, but when it gets to the end production, end line, then you have, all of those documents you already use, the DFMEA, all of those are part of that.
Sure. And we have issues list, and then there's always a column about what the resolution is going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can close the loop on this.
Anyone else?
Just a comment too, and actually this came up in a prior session, just another example of how we can jot off an email and not think about that that it might be subpoenaed at some point or become part of discovery. Ben Anusin gave a good example of he had to do some testimony, and one of the emails that they put in front of him was from a quality engineer, not a current employee, but a quality engineer, that it just said oops. All the documents said was oops, and he had to try to explain what that was about with no other context, right? And it could have been just oops, the email wasn't supposed to go to you, I meant to email someone
Oops,
else,
I'm late for a meeting
or oops, I'm late for a meeting, or oops, I forgot an attachment, but that's all it said. And so the plaintiff's attorney was trying to say, well, was that related to a device failure? See, because there was nothing, and there was no context. So I think that's a really good example of context, right? Anything can be taken out of context and closing the loop. If it just had a little bit more to that, then it wouldn't have ever been an issue.
And I've gotten emails where they are inflammatory from the field, right? And I make a policy, I don't forward that on, because the next time you forward it's another time it gets recorded.
Yeah.
You pick the phone up, you call, you make that decision, because, if you forward it on even one or two people, then all of a sudden,
You don't know who
they
they're
start
sending it to,
responding.
yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you've got a huge chain where it's much easier to find. And I go through and I delete that.
It's still there.
As well as you don't know how the next person somebody else down the chain is gonna respond to that email as well, so that's one of the.
Yeah, you don't need the house is on fire pile on.
Which is another reason why we make sure we have sales call them in and try to avoid anything in writing on email. To have them call them in with that detail, but really the dealer should be calling it in. Try to emphasize to have sales
keep selling, and then that secondhand information, so I think you guys agree, when the dealers call in, they kinda know the drill already, they know what questions you're gonna ask them, right? Typically, so they've got all that information, they've got the file right there, it's not being handed down to 2 and 3 different people, and by the time you get it, it's a whole different story. So that, to get, you know, the accurate information as quick as possible, try to always make sure. And I believe most of it is coming in by phone now. I don't, Juan in Cleveland, is most of the stuff coming in on phone, not in writing, and you
Yeah,
guys
when
get
we
it?
get a call.
Okay, good, good.
Yes.
So as far as emails, should we be deleting everything, or should we be archiving anything, and how do you distinguish what we're supposed to be keeping as far as emails and what we're supposed to get rid of?
So I think that's a document retention issue, that will probably be addressed going forward.
The thing to remember is that just because you delete the email, it still exists out there. And it is discoverable. You think you deleted it, it still exists. It's like, once you post something to the web, it's there forever. It doesn't go away. You might look like it's gone, but it's not really gone. Not until IT purges all the databases does it disappear. So we're gonna look at document retention going forward, about how we can do some regular purges. There's certain things, as Kate mentioned, that we're, from a regulatory perspective, required to keep for a long time, especially because our products have long life. You know, like a Quickie 2 has been out there forever and it's still sold today. So we are required to keep a lot of documents. But emails are a little different. The whole email string, we can have a separate policy for email retention, and we are looking at that, and we'll have, our goal would be to have IT do a purge, which means they do purge off the actual servers and they're gone. But we're gonna be talking about that. We see that as a risk because of all this chatter. I think the key thing is, though, think before you write, because it's there. And that includes text messages. I've seen people think that they're saying, well, the email's out there archived, but they can't get to my text messages. Wrong. Your text messages
It
can
also
also
goes to like
be.
Facebook and all
Like
that.
anything on Facebook, anything on social media,
If you write
anything you're
about your job on
posting.
Facebook and you make inflammatory statements about, boy, I can't believe we're still selling this product and
It's there
these
forever. It
problems."
doesn't go away.
Yeah.
And just as a general policy, don't ever write about your job on Facebook,
No.
even if you go to work for a different company, just,
Yeah.
Just
it's
don't
a
do
good
it.
policy.
Yeah.
Firm firewall.
When you say, text messages, does that mean, personal, are they able to get stuff that you know, it's not business phone, it's your personal phone that you're texting?
I think if it's, for example, like if it's a sales rep we have, or if it were me, employed by the company, my phone I use for both personal and business, right? They could subpoena what's on my phone in terms of text messages, especially if I'm text messaging colleagues in the company. So, yes, in that case. If you've got a personal phone and you've never used it for that, I don't know, maybe they
They
could, but
might try, but I don't
but
try.
probably
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's different for those of us that deal, you know, we have a phone that's used for both. The company might reimburse us for partial use of that phone because we use it for business. In that case, whatever we have used that for, it might be
In that connection,
subpoenaed.
if he was to email or text you, it's gonna come up on your
It'll come on my
her
phone, right.
So then it
That's a
opens
link.
the
Then that might
door
be.
for you.
Yeah.
The other thing too, it's, I think, against your company policy to email your personal
Right.
email. But if you ever send something from your work email to your personal email, then they would be able to subpoena all of your personal email as well.
Another reason, not only is it against company policy to do that, another reason not to, because you would be subject to subpoena.
If you
So-
forward something from your work email to your personal email, that is a link for them to follow to subpoena all of your personal emails. Because there's a connection.
Well, we have dealers sometimes that will want pictures of stuff or whatnot. So like we have product like out in the cage where we'll take pictures of it.
Yeah.
And then we send it to our own Sunrise email and then forward it to them that way.
Huh.
So that's why I've always said in the past, You should never use your phone, that's something that management should be doing.
Yeah.
Right, I would say that's probably a good practice, just to keep yourself
And was
fresh.
there not pictures on the web? 'Cause
Sometimes you just need the product, you know what I mean? You just need it in order
Yeah.
for them to be able to like remove it, put it back or whatnot.
Sandy, do you guys have the digital camera in customer service for CSRs to use?
Yeah,
Rather than use their
Leanna
personal
does,
phone?
and we've got a couple, you know,
That's
the
probably right.
Yeah,
iPads
that's
and
probably
the
the
protect.
best practice.
Yeah, or I can grab any
Right.
of the management.
Because I've had Dean that would do that for me before.
Yeah, that's not a problem.
It was like, wow.
That's what we've done in the returns area, we actually purchased a camera for returns so that they're not using their personal phone to take,
Yeah.
photos of product that comes back, they were doing that before, so we purchased a digital camera for them for that purpose, so they weren't using their personal phone for that.
Now, if you use like FaceTime, or if you use an app for a phone call, is that traceable?
I don't know.
I mean,
It's a good
'cause you say
question.
pick up the phone and call them,
Yeah.
and those phone calls are not recorded internally, they are if they're in customer service,
But, right, internally, they're not.
so those aren't,
But only incoming calls, external calls from customer service are not recorded.
but if I call Roxanne,
It's not
You know,
recorded.
yeah,
It's only
not yet.
not yet.
Because I mean, at some point,
I mean, the
everything's
NSA
gonna be
might
out
know,
there,
but I
right?
think you're probably
I
safe.
mean,
We
you
don't
know,
record.
it seems like Google's always listening, you know?
Yeah.
I'm just talking about something and it pops up on my phone, it's
Alexa's
like,
out
okay,
there.
somebody's
Yeah,
listening.
Alexa's always.
Well, we can say that, I don't know.
You can't.
So, if, like, we're over in Built for Me, and so we're contacting, customer service a lot, when we call them, are those recorded?
Yes.
And
Right,
actually,
that would
and-
have to, if they
yeah,
are,
yeah, they
I think
usually
they
are,
are,
yes,
customer
yeah.
service calls.
And you know, those have helped us a lot of times, working with
Yeah.
Helen when we subpoena, and I just wanted to say thank you to specifically, you know, the customer service team, because overall, I think the documentation has been pretty good, and myself and all the, supervisors are spending a lot more time getting documentation together for different legal issues, and it's kinda like playing CSI a little bit, but it's a great feeling when everything, you can find everything that you need and it's all right there, and it has helped Sunrise tremendously, so that's what we wanna continue to do, is just make sure that documentation is solid. But yeah, we pulled phone calls before, you know, and the cleaner it is, the easier it is for our attorneys to kinda, you know.
If there's
look
a
into that.
thorough documentation trail and all of the loops have been closed and the testing was good, it can demonstrate that there was no defect.
And that has happened.
Yeah. Right.
But this is to keep that part of it going, and there's always room for improvement, cause, you know, even though we've had some really good cases, we've had some really atrocious cases, so.
And we
it-
wanna avoid those.
Yeah, and so this is just to help us make sure we stay
Right.
on the top and
Yeah.
have those, connections, cause it's so simple, if you ever sit there and watch how the chain goes and where the attorney follows from point A to point B, all the way down, and they do a really good job, and then they find something, and then they dive into it. So it's that hole, you close that loop, you say, yep, situation's fixed, this is what we did, this is what it was, even if it was something that was out there before, and you said, oh, I remember, I need to go back and close that loop. That will show, because that person may not work here, you know, but you still have, cause it's been years, but you see something open, you can still close that loop, because that will come back, and they'll be able to find it and, you know, say, we're done. We did our problem solving, it's complete.
And that's actually a good point too, like if you happen to write one of those inflammatory emails, you're frustrated or angry about something that's happened, and you write in the heat of the moment, it is okay. Respond to that email and say, you know what, I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't have spoken so hastily. What I meant to say was, and clarify with just the facts. Try to fix it if that situation does happen.
One other thing, I know sometimes when we're entering complaints into the system, I know CSRs like to put notes into C2 as well in the order notes. And I've seen in the order notes where some of the CSRs will elaborate more than what's been put in the complaint notes. But those notes that are in C2 and that are also discoverable as Helen Helen will ask me what notes are in this order, and I've sent those over because those have been in there. So just because you put it in C2 and not in the complaint, it's still discoverable, and they can still see those notes.
Yeah, and they should be consistent.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. If you wanna just print it out.
That's right.
No, we're not, no, we're.
The way I can see that email.